Good morning and welcome to another Seize the Day. I trust that you guys had a really good night's sleep, ready to begin a new day, and that your week has been a good one. This has been a full week for us here in the Borea household, and I'm sure for many for you as well. We have an opportunity to close out looking at the Beatitudes this morning, and I trust that they will continue to just be a real source of encouragement for you. You know, we have, if I could just recap just a bit, one of the things that I try to do in giving us the bigger picture of these particular passages that we're looking at is to just pick up on thoughts that I begin to bring forward in the weekend messages. So this past Sunday, I talked about this whole topic of the Beatitudes, and I put that under the umbrella of who is really well off, and who are those that are truly blessed in this life. And so, consequently, what I did was I turned to the passages, and I'd like to just read for you the Beatitudes again, just so that we have those in our minds as we're thinking about them. It says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I pointed out that in these Beatitudes, if you look at the very first and the last Beatitude, you'll see that they both end with this blessing that theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so I point that out so that you would see that there is the sense of a parentheses that is being formed. And in that parentheses, the topics of kingdom of heaven and kingdom of heaven bracket all of these Beatitudes. And I tell you that because it's a literary way of causing us to think of all of these Beatitudes in terms of this kingdom fulfillment, that in the kingdom of heaven, which is really saying under the rule of God, under God's rule, these things will demonstrate a particular blessing. So when we think of these Beatitudes, I also want you to think of the crowds that had been forming around Jesus. They come, it says that Jesus began his ministry by teaching in their synagogue, preaching the good news of the kingdom. And then also it says that he went around healing all disease and sickness. So the idea of Jesus going, teaching, preaching, proclaiming, and healing is a part of the way in which Jesus has now begun this public ministry as the promised Messiah that had been prophesied about, centuries and centuries before. So in this work, crowds begin to form. People, no doubt, came because of the teaching that Jesus gave them in the synagogues. People who were theologically, curious as to what this teacher was saying. Others, they came for more pragmatic reasons. They were hurting. They were not on that leading edge of society. Perhaps many overlooked. Not many options. You find that as the text spells out for us, it says that there were many who had come from the larger regions of Palestine, those up north, going all the way down south to Judea. The Jordan River was a dividing line, and yet from both sides of that river, whether it was from the towns of the Decapolis or on the side of Galilee, all that region, people were coming to Jesus. So it gives you the impression that Jesus has been ministering for a while, and now his reputation is beginning to widen. People are coming, and when they come, it says they come with various diseases, people in severe pain, people paralyzed, people having seizures, as well as those who spiritually are just being assaulted. It says those who were demon possessed. So this crowd is a hurting crowd, not ones in which there may be a great deal of hope. And so when you look at this passage, what I want you to think in your minds then is the people who are hearing these words of Jesus. So when Jesus says to those who are poor, he goes, yours is the kingdom of heaven. He's telling them that God has not forgotten them. Or we looked at, blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And you recognize that in this mourning, there is a sense that that there are people here who include grief, not just be caused by personal sin and loss, but perhaps also by some of the social evil and oppression of their day. God's going to comfort them in part and fully in the future. That's why it says they will be comforted. God is going to meet us in the here and now. But many of these promises, you also see there is a sense of a future fulfillment that's going to take place. You know, if I could, just for a minute, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this already and not yet. There is, if you look at the first and last of these Beatitudes, the first Beatitude says, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Look at verse 8. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So there is this possession of the kingdom of God in the present. God, there are promises that God is going to fulfill for us now. It's not that we have to wait for heaven somehow or another, to realize all these promises, and we're just living always in the sense of anticipation. But God says He'll meet us now. How many promises can you think of where Jesus is telling us that God will never leave you or forsake you, right? That there is no trial that you have experienced that God is not present. He says that He will not allow you to be tried beyond what you're able to bear, but He's faithful, and He says that the trials that we face, they're common to men in this world. He also says to us that in your weakness, my strength is going to be made sufficient. See, so many of these promises God is making to us in the present now, as we come to this place where we strengthen our relationship with Jesus. But it's also true that there's going to be times in the future when all things are going to be resolved. The decay of our creation, the mortality of our own bodies, right? We are going to experience life in such an abundant way that we have not experienced it in this life. So the promises of Jesus always come with this present peace, but also a peace that is yet to come. And you see that in these Beatitudes. When he talks about a meek person, for instance, blessed are the meek, they'll inherit the earth. He's not necessarily thinking of just someone who is someone you could just walk all over, but someone who is humble and gentle, and perhaps the best way to say it is they're just not really that aggressive. And usually in our culture, we think of those people who are not going to get ahead. This is a dog eat dog world, right? Like where you gotta, if you're gonna make your way, man, you're gonna have to force your way into this. This is all for the hard charger, man. Type A, let's go. And yet here's God telling you and me that the ones who are going to inherit the earth are truly those who are humbled and gentle. And the future reward is one in which God is going to bless them beyond their wildest expectations. We looked at hungering and thirsting after God's righteousness, and we see that this idea of righteousness is all about right living. It's about looking at your life and then putting it alongside God's wills and desires, and recognizing that my life needs to conform more and more to Him. I think there are many of you who are watching this morning who are familiar with the text in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, where it says, "Do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but what? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might prove what God's will is, that which is good, acceptable, perfect." See, the will of God is something that was given to us so that we could thrive. Very, very often we're making decisions that are only making life harder. And God is saying, no, 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 don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Because we have been called to live in this kingdom of heaven under God's rule. And so we took a look at that yesterday as we looked at James chapter 4. And in James chapter 4, we began to see how the source of quarrels and conflicts among us was the desires that raged within us. And then as we sought to fulfill those desires, it brought all kinds of trouble. And it says, rather, we ought to humble ourselves, right? Submit ourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from us. Isn't that a great promise? Think about that. Submit to God and resist the devil, and he will flee. Very often, when we're faced with all kinds of real temptation, just to be honest, there's either a problem of us submitting or a problem of us resisting. And then we wonder why things never really get better. It's because, see, we're not that convinced that following God's way is going to be the way of life. It's going to be the best alternative for me. And yet, James was clear, right? We need to humble ourselves before God, submit to him, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. If the devil's not fleeing, maybe it's a time where we just sit back and we think, okay, is this a test that is simply external, that God is just trying me, right? That I might develop perseverance and proven character, because that's not beyond God's ways either, right? But at the same time, there could be that the trials that come into my life are brought upon myself. I'm not resisting. I'm not humbling myself before God. I'm not really being attentive to his will and ways. So I find myself being conformed too much to this world. This beatitude that says to us, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, there's a desire to see that God's will, God's ways are established and obeyed in this life. We're hungering after that. We're thirsting after that. And usually hungering and thirsting are not really qualities that we necessarily would want to experience on a daily basis here, but we want those things to be satisfied. And God is saying, you hunger and thirst after me. You hunger and thirst after my will, my ways, and you will be satisfied. You will be filled. So let's look at a few of these others today on this Friday. Look at this word merciful. You know, the word merciful here also embraces the idea of a person who is generous, who is forgiving, who is demonstrating a level of compassion for those who are suffering. And the link then here that we see is an interesting one between our mercy and God's mercy. It says, blessed are the merciful, for what? For they will be shown mercy. So God is promising you to receive what it is that he's asking. You know, what he's looking at, people saying, this is what is going to be blessed in this kingdom. So those who are out there Don't feel like you're getting the short end of the stick. Don't feel like you're being a sucker for someone else. Recognize that when you walk in these ways, when you are demonstrating a generous and compassionate, nature to you, God says you're going to receive in abundance the same mercy. There is a great text that I think is being echoed in this text here, and it comes from the Old Testament book called Micah. You know what? As we're talking, I'll write this in here so that you would have it as a reference. So it's Micah, and Micah chapter 6, verse 8, and this is a really interesting text. It says, "He has showed you, O man, what is good." Speaking of God, right? It says, "God has showed you, O man, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you." What is it that God is actually requiring from us? And again, I want you to remember this is coming from an Old Testament prophet, Micah, and yet these are the same words that are being echoed in the Beatitude, because it's never just a new story. It's an old story that God is just beginning to give us a fuller and fuller picture of. He says, so God has showed you, oh man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, right? Hungering and thirsting for righteousness, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Boy, think about that in terms of being a standard by which we begin to really mark out our life. God is asking us to walk in his ways, to demonstrate a compassion and generosity to those around us, and to humble ourselves so that we are submitting our will to his, so that we find ourselves in positions where we can be instructed, where God could lead us and teach us. It's when we think we have all the answers and we're just going after it our own way that God is saying, well, you don't receive because you don't ask. And when you ask, you're asking with wrong motives that you might spend it on your own pleasure. Later on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to say it this way. He's going to say, seek and you will find, ask and the door will be opened, right? Seek and you will find, ask and it will be given, knock and the door will be opened. So this idea of seeking and asking and knocking, God's saying it's showing something about your willingness to walk humbly with God, to ask him to begin to reform your ways so that they become much more reflective of his. And so here in this beatitude of blessed are the merciful, what we're finding is he's asking us to embrace these characteristics of generosity and forgiveness and compassion, because that's what God has been doing for these people all along. In fact, there is a great passage that's found in the book of Exodus, chapter 34. It's a great passage where it's I'll write this down for you. Moses, when he came down, if you remember the story, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, what did he discover? When Moses came down, he discovered that while he was away, those 40 days, the people had begun to ask Aaron to form for them a golden calf. They erected an idol. Think about this for a moment, because it tells you something about the heart of man. And when you read the Bible, it's not just something that's speaking of a world or a culture that is so far removed from us. God has just delivered Israel from an oppressive regime in Egypt, where it said for 400 years they were held as slaves. Think about how many generations. People usually 30 years as a marker for a generation. So here you have 400 years. Think of how many generations of people have lived under the oppressive regime of Pharaoh, of Egypt. And now God comes and he delivers them, and he delivers them in such a miraculous way that that without an army, Pharaoh is moved to just let the Israelites go. They leave, they assemble at Mount Sinai. God's about to give them instruction, which also is telling, right? God is going to give them instruction on how they are to live in this promised land that he is about to give them. So those 10 commandments that were given were the commandments that God was giving, and there were 603 other ones, but those 10 that were written on this tablet, they had everything to do with our relationship with God, and they had everything to do with our relationship with our fellow man. Don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't lie, don't covet, right? All of these things, how we deal with one another, and also remember to remember the Lord thy God, that you should have no other gods before him. Don't create any graven images. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Don't, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Like all of those vertical relationships that I have with God ought to be also seen in the horizontal relationships that I'm having with other people. So this word that God has given was meant to set them up so that they can flourish and live this great life in this new land that God gives them. And what do? They turn around and they make an idol. And the next thing you know, Moses comes down from having met with God, and he finds the people in such disarray. And so here in Exodus 34 and verse 6, I'll put this up here so that you can go back and look at this as well. Let me read the context here for you. It says, the Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stones like the first ones, that I will write on them the words that were on the first tablet, which you broke. Right? Because when Moses came down the first time and saw the people, engaged in all this idolatrous worship, he took those tablets and he threw them down, right? Well, now this is the second time that God has given them his word. He says, I want you to write them on the tablets that were out. And he says, be ready in the morning and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or be seen anywhere on the mountain. Not even the flocks and herds may graze in the front of the mountain. So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, went up Mount Sinai early in the morning, and as the Lord had commanded him, and he carried the 2 stones in his 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. Right? This is Yahweh. This is the name that was given to Moses, the I am. And then notice what God says. This is Exodus 34, verse 6. He passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes, up to the 3rd and 4th generation. God just gave a description of himself to a people who already had demonstrated such a rebellion not long after God had given them such a miraculous deliverance. I talk to people sometimes about faith, and they're like, well, if I lived in a day and an age where I saw some of the miracles that the Bible purports, not only Jesus accomplished, but that God did in the Old Testament, man, I'd have no problems believing, implying that, hey, if I was part of the Israelites, for instance, that were taken out of Egypt in the manner in which they were taken, I would walk across this Red Sea that God would part. I would see those waters collapse on all of the soldiers of the Egyptians that were chasing them down because they had changed their mind and they were about to try and destroy the Israelites again. If I would have been there, if I saw that, man, I would be all in. Really? You do think that? Because notice that what just took place here. These people, they experienced this. And it's not very long after that they're going back into their own ways. Why? Because there's always this tension between my will and God's will, the way I'm going to live my life and the way in which God is calling me to live this life. There's always going to be this sense of tension. That's why God's saying, can I tell you, those who are going to be blessed in the kingdom of heaven are those who are being shown mercy. Because God at his core is saying, I'm a God full of compassion, forgiving men's sins to the second, third generation. He says, I'm all in for you. And what I'm doing is I'm asking you now to seek first my kingdom, this righteousness. And you watch that, how I will bless you. Let's go on. Look at here in verse 8. It says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. The one who is pure in heart begins to exhibit a single-minded devotion to God that begins first by repenting. I am leaving this old life, and now I am pursuing this new life that Jesus has promised me. I'm allowing room in my life now for Jesus to bring his wisdom to bear into my life. And so consequently, you can see that this idea of purity in heart, it's going to be impossible for you and me to do this perfectly. But the reality is here, when you look at this text, God is asking you and me to be holy as he is holy. It's going to be a prerequisite, which is why we're going to need the cleansing of Jesus to do that in our life, to forgive us of our sin, to clothe us with his righteousness. Because this idea of purity is something that God is going to demand. But he's like, look, if you're chasing after this, he says, you will see God. Think about that. This is that invitation to come and really get to know God better by beginning to purify my heart so that it reflects more and more of God's will and his way. One more, when we look down here and in verse 9, it says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Here, peacemakers focus on interpersonal relationships. People who are seeking to get engaged and bring harmony. Sometimes we're a little hesitant to get involved in this way because we get into this mindset that, well, this is really none of my business. We're going to look at a passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says that you have heard that it was written, thou shalt not murder. But I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, you've killed him already. Then in the text, he says, if you're on your way to the temple and there you remember that your brother has something against you, he says, first be reconciled with your brother and then bring your gift. In other words, what good does it do to engage in this worship service, to play the role of a devoted follower, and yet you're harboring or allowing to harbor this discontent between you and your brother? You see, being this peacemaker is demonstrating, it says, that this is what God is doing all the time. God is always trying to bring peace between us and him. There's always going to be this time when God, he forgives sin 70 times 7. And now he's asking you to show yourself to be the children of God by doing the same things to others. We all want the forgiveness of God. It's kind of hard to extend that to other people, isn't it? And lastly, it says here, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness' sake. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. See, all of these characteristics which Jesus labels as blessed, don't you find that they're usually not that welcome in the world? They mistake being meek as being a pushover, merciful as being too soft, right? Trying to be a pure in heart as, goody two shoes. Like, there is in the world, you could see that these qualities that Jesus is looking at, these labels that he's given, these characteristics, he says that it's not fully appreciated. The result is that people are going to very often misunderstand one's motives, and you're going to be found holding the short end of that stick. Well, time has run out. I hope you gained a little bit better of an appreciation for what's going on here. But always remember that the blessing doesn't lie in the condition, right? It doesn't lie just in, mourning, right? The blessing lies in the kingdom of heaven, whereby God says he is going to bless us. That life will become different. It is a reward that is offered to those now who have set their hearts and minds on him. This is all of what Jesus is saying are those who are truly well off. And that's the life that's going to be for eternity. So, my friends, I hope these have been words that have encouraged you. Tune in this week as we begin to take a further look in the Sermon on the Mount and begin to ask the question, what does it mean really then to live as a citizen in this kingdom of heaven? How is this really supposed to, what are the duties that fall to one who says, I want to be a part of this kingdom? We're going to take a look at that this coming weekend. And then next week, we'll begin to unpack it a little bit further. So you go today, seize the day, live with your mind set on things above. And remember that God is good all the time. May you experience a great weekend. Love to see you guys in worship. Let's gather together on the weekend. And wherever you are, and perhaps in other parts of the world, I trust that you're doing the same. Love being a part of this community. I hope it just challenges us all. God bless you. Lord willing, we'll see each other next week. God bless.